Hey, we're Greaser Consulting, your Houston for sales engagement. Today in this video, you're going to learn arguably the most important, the most critical sales engagement function that there is, and that is the content manager. They're like the conductor of the symphony, making everyone play so beautifully together. Are you ready to learn? Let's go. Hey, we're talking about the sales engagement functions and just the importance of having these support functions to support your sales engagement operation and initiatives. And without these sales engagement functions, things can just go awry, and you can't sustain it over the long term. And you can't have the success that you really want. So today I've got Erika Davis, who is the head of content here at Greaser Consulting. She's the brains behind our content strategy, the brains behind, helping tons of companies with their content. And so we're going to talk about one of the really crucial, if not from a content standpoint, the most crucial function, and that is the content manager. And so, Erika, I want to first start with what are the consequences of not having the function of a content manager?
Thanks, Theron. Yeah, I think one of the key things that we look for when we go into an organization and we're focused on their content supply chain is we look at the roles and responsibilities around sales content creation. And if I ask who's in charge of creating content and the answer is, well, everybody sometimes, it's really clear that there's not a defined content manager.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, is that typical? We started an engagement with someone. One of the things that I feel like when we have conversations with folks is hey, we see this all the time. So if that's you out there and no one owns content or manages it, or you've got 5 or 6 people doing it, just rest assured, that is normal, but it doesn't have to stay that way.
Another thing that happens without a content manager is that content isn't produced on a consistent or reliable timeline. And one of the reasons that is because if there's no central point of content creation within an org, then you'll have maybe a quarterly sales play, or a team member will raise their hand and they'll say, hey, let's put these new pieces of content into our sales engagement platform. And then it'll get done, but then there's no continuity. There's no way to say, let's do this every quarter, or let's review this content every quarter, because since it's an aside of everyone's job, everyone can be thinking, well, someone else will get to it, and it's not a key responsibility. So that's something else that I see a lot, is that content is created in sort of bursts throughout the year, but there's no comprehensive strategy, and the content manager is really responsible for holding that together.
Got it. So we're talking about consequences of not having the function. Roles and responsibilities around sales content creation can be unclear. Content becomes an aside of everyone's job. No one really owns it or manages it. It's just kind of we do this as an organization type of thing, and that can get super, super messy, especially over time. And then there's not a reliable, timeline. Hey, here is when we do certain things. And one of the things I think about is if you think about sales, right? And especially from a full cycle standpoint, a rep will go and prospect, fill their pipeline up, and it's all right, we got this great pipe. We spent all this time prospecting. We've got this great pipeline then, and now they got, the pipeline's so good that they're focused on the pipeline, and then prospecting goes on the wayside, right? And so it's very there's peaks and valleys, and I could see where that can be the same case with content. Is that what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, that's true. If you're only producing content with, a vision of the next month or the next quarter, by the time that content is effective and you start to build your pipeline, you need to backfill that with something. And if you don't have, evergreen sequences, or you don't have a comprehensive content strategy, that strategy is going to be short-lived, and you're going to always be kind of scrambling to get to the next thing.
Yeah, can you talk about what is a content manager's role when it does come to content strategies? How does that work?
Yeah, so you can think of your content manager as the executive branch of your content supply chain. And by that I mean they don't necessarily plan the strategy or, have say in the leadership level when you're talking about your content strategy and how it supports your overall go-to-market strategy. But the content manager is responsible for making sure all of the functions are running fluidly and that content is being created on a very specific timeline. And because the content manager touches all aspects of the content supply chain, which we have other videos about the other functions if you want to learn more about those in depth. But the content manager is really the central point of contact within the content supply chain. And so they also can act, in addition to being the executive branch of your content supply chain, they can also act as sort of a connector. So if writers need to access someone on the marketing team, the content manager is really responsible for being that key point of contact where everyone knows that they know what's going on. And then they can make sure that everything is being done and they're responsible for reporting that up.
I love it. A sales rep manages their pipeline. A content manager manages the content supply chain.
Exactly.
All right, so what else? What other responsibilities does a content manager have? I mean, I think about, if you're looking at your sales engagement platform, you might have a bunch of sequences, you might have a bunch of cadences. What is their role with making sure that gets managed and in a way that, the whole reason why we're doing content, right, is to help companies get pipeline, to help the sales team execute upon the sales process, right? So, what's the content manager's role in making sure that happens?
Yeah, so in addition to being kind of the coordinator of other functions on the content supply chain, they're also responsible for organizing the content within your sales engagement platform. And so this could be anything from knowing when to A/B test or reiterate content, making any hands-on changes like tag strategy or creating new collections or uploading new content that's created by the content writer. You can think of this as the things that reps would hardly ever be incentivized to do if you were to make them sort of the content managers, which is something that we see in a lot of organizations, is that a sales rep loves to write new sequences, but obviously because that leads to pipeline, but the things like making sure that content is continuously A/B tested, making sure it's tagged properly so other reps can find it, making sure that it's, assigned to the appropriate collection, and even doing things like, making sure there's not a ton of repetitive content in an instance, which also kind of goes with the content owner, but the content manager, it's very important that they're doing those hands-on organizational items within content, not the technical side necessarily, but within content to make sure that kind of the not so glamorous jobs within the content supply chain are being done and being executed. It's really important that there's kind of a central point of contact that's responsible for executing that.
Yeah. And I think about there's a lot of coordination that has to happen, like if you're putting on some theater production, you've got to have different roles that are doing certain things, and depending on the size of the organization, they could have someone that's literally headcount, like a full-time person doing content management. So and sometimes that's one of our recommendations is to have that, but sometimes it's there's somebody on the team that has the bandwidth that can, depend on the size of the team and the scope of the sales engagement operation, that they can, just fulfill that function. My question to you is who does the content manager, you talked about the different roles and interacting with different, who do they interact with? How do they play with the other functions that we've been talking about in these videos?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know we talk about this a lot, but I think it's important to delineate the difference between a function and a role. So a content manager is a function, and that role could be or that function could be performed by the team manager, right? On a smaller team, you have the team manager who also can act as the content manager, or it could be, the sales enablement manager, or it could be the director of sales, depending on, on your team size and how you choose to break down those functions. And I think it's important to think of it as a function because it might be one person doing all of these functions I'm about to describe, and it could be one person that's solely responsible for performing one of those functions as a full-time job. job, just really depending not only on the organization size, but also on the kind of on the depth of your strategy. We go into some enterprise organizations, and like a global instance, they might have one sales enablement or sales engagement person that's responsible for being the content manager for like 20 teams. And then we also go into organizations that have the same functionality with a team of 20 instead of 20 individual teams. So as you try to expand your strategy, you're going to need more headcount. And I know we talk about that all the time, but it's something I think teams overlook because they don't realize how heavy of a lift this is. So just something to keep in mind as we talk about functions. It's distinct from role, and we talk about that on
sales
purpose.
Engagement, and then it's kind of like, all right, we need a technical admin to make sure we're overseeing this platform and all the technical stuff. But a lot of times the content stuff is either like, hey, marketing, we need your help to write content, which can be great. It could also be, throw things off as well because the marketing conversations are different than what a sales conversation is. And the biggest thing here is that your salespeople have to have confidence in the messaging. If they don't, they're not going to use it. And so that's really key. And I think which really plays into the other functions that a manager is going to interact with, and it has to be, content writers. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and I think in a healthy content supply chain, you have input from marketing and you have input from sales. Marketing does a really good job of creating that one-to-many communication where you can have white papers, or you could have case studies, or you could have, statistics that are really useful to articulate your value proposition. And then sales writers are really important for taking that data and that information and making it really conversational. So it would sound, Theron, just like you and I are talking right now. One of the things, and this is a little off topic, but we're about to talk about content writers. And one of the things that I always tell people is read your email out loud. And if you wouldn't say that to somebody on a call or face-to-face, don't send that email.
Don't do it. Don't send it.
If you read a lot of marketing copy, it sounds, really, really great. It's very emotional, but it might not be exactly how you would talk. Not all the time, right? I don't want to generalize, but typically that's the difference that we see. And so the content writer in this case, going back to the functions that the content manager works with, the content writer is typically kind of housed within the sales organization. It could be, for example, in some teams, they might have someone on the marketing team who's a content writer that's going to do, to function as the sales content writer. But one thing that's always true in our recommendations is that this person function as a sales content writer in a different way than they function as a marketing content writer. And we have best practices for that.
Why is that?
Yeah, it's really to encourage adoption, right? When marketing is creating assets, they're typically not consulting sales reps to say, hey, is this going to help you build your pipeline? Marketing has their own KPIs, and they're making assets that are going to help with their KPIs. A sales content writer is primarily working with sales reps to scale what they're writing manually. And so what we find is sales reps typically write, let's say a follow-up email to an introduction conversation. Typically that email, it has personalization, obviously, right? It has notes from the call. It has, specific pain points that the prospect is experiencing. And so that sales rep is going to send a follow-up email that's maybe 20 to 30% distinct, but 70 to 80% of that follow-up email is going to be exactly the same as every other follow-up email for that purpose, right? And so the idea would be for the content writer to be a really good listener and understand how much of that process can be automated, but what's really, really important to be left manual. And that's a very specific function that sales uniquely needs, and specifically sales organizations who are utilizing a sales engagement platform to kind of hold their strategy together.
I think one of the things that we're seeing is that people are catching on to this. First off, they do realize that, listen, we can't use the same messaging for sales that we do for marketing. So people do realize that. But a lot of times it's like, well, how do we make this transition? We've got a marketing team that is producing amazing content and messaging, from nurturing email campaigns and so forth. And one of the things that a lot of times we often help do is translate that marketing speak into sales speak, right? And so if you're able in your organization to take a look at your have that the marketing communication, say, listen, let's take those messages, those themes, and let's get it into sales speak and how a person would actually communicate that to another human being, then we've got something going. So what I want to ask you is, like, what is the content manager's role in facilitating that? Because that is huge. That is like that's part of the developing your content supply chain. So what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So this really touches kind of the top of the sales content supply chain. If you think about it as a funnel, right? The top of that funnel is going to be the solution owner, or sometimes we call it the content owner. And that
which we have another video about. We got another video about. So if you want to go deeper into that, you can watch that video.
I won't spoil it too much. But basically what the content writer does, the content manager does, is they take directive from the solution owner when new content is going to be introduced into the sales engagement platform. One thing, Theron, as you were talking, that I was thinking that's a really important point is that typically organizations who are getting their outbound messaging from a marketing team, a lot of times that outbound messaging is solely focused on getting an initial meeting, but it doesn't really support the sales rep throughout the sales cycle. And sales engagement platforms, despite what a lot of people think, they're not only for getting that initial meeting. It's not purely a prospecting tool. It's also a tool to hold your whole sales process together from, the first meeting to closing that contract and handing it off to an account manager or a CSM. And so I think it's really important to consider that when you're thinking about being a content manager. It's not only about cold outbound messaging. It's also about saying, hey, are there process sequences here? Are there nurture sequences here? How are events being communicated to prospects and maybe even current customers, depending on the breakdown of the accounts within your sales org? And so that content manager is not only responsible for that, getting that initial meeting with content. I just think that's such an important point because it's a really common thing that we go in and audit an instance and we find, 80 to 90% of the content is cold outbound or, initial inbound messaging, but there's hardly anything in the middle or the end of the funnel. And so we think that's a huge miss by a lot of teams. And again, the content manager would be responsible for that whole process. In terms of the other functions that the content manager works with, so they'll receive, I think there in your question actually was, how does the content manager sort of work with the writer to organize the creation process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the content manager receives that directive from the solution owner to create that content, and then the content manager really organizes that working group. So in that working group would definitely be the content writer. It would be a subject matter expert from your team. Maybe it's someone in marketing, maybe it's a product marketer, maybe it's your VP of sales. It depends on how your org is structured, but there's always a subject matter expert involved in the writing process.
That's the key right there.
Yeah.
Subject matter expert. You got to get them involved.
Yeah. And then reps, end users, that's the other thing. I know especially account executives, their time is incredibly valuable. I would not advise to create a lot of content towards the end of the month or end of the quarter because you're not going to get a lot of input. Yeah. We've tried that a lot of times. But it's really important to involve end users, involve subject matter experts, and the content manager is really responsible for bringing the content writer in contact with those people that are going to be important for writing that sequence. And then the content manager receives that content from the content writer, does the hands-on work of putting it in the sales engagement platform, making sure it's organized. And since that content manager is really hands-on in the full life cycle of that content, the content manager is the best person to plug that in, make sure it's good to go, and then they hand that off to the content enablement person, who again could be your general sales enablement person, it could be your team manager, it could be the content manager, depending on how the org is structured, but someone needs to be responsible for informing the team that new content is ready to go and letting them know how to use it and why it's there. And so that's kind of the handoff point. And then later on down the life cycle of that new content, the content analyst will then let the content manager know when that content either needs to be retired or when it needs to be A/B tested, or if it's underperforming or overperforming, or if they're seeing any outliers or patterns emerge that the content manager should be aware of. And then that's kind of a feedback loop that gets created between the analyst, the manager, the writer, and then enablement. So that's, it kind of continues as long as that content is relevant.
This person needs to be somebody, all right, take note of this. This needs to be someone that knows how to communicate well and over-communicate, because they are orchestrating. Think of them as a conductor. They're orchestrating your content supply chain. And they're working with sales, they're working with content owners, solution owners, they're working with marketing, they're working with all these writers, reps. Like there's a lot to orchestrate, and they have to be really good at communicating. And so I want to transition off of, first off, that was awesome. A lot of times it's hard to know, like, well, how does this actually work? Like, what are the different functions that are needed and so forth? So, like, I think piecing that together is huge, Erika. But I want to transition into, let's talk about some of the common problems that this function runs into, and not just talk about the problems, but, like, how do they overcome them? So it might be issues within, like, communication might be one of them, right? But what are other, some problems, just to give them a heads up on, so that they might be able to not have to fall in that booby trap.
Oh yeah, I feel my anxiety rising just thinking about what could happen to the content manager if these problems happen. But one of the things that can happen, since this person is kind of the central point of contact for all of these different working groups and functions, is there could be misalignment among different groups. And so, for example, marketing could have one idea about what this sales play should look like, and leadership could have a different idea, and then reps could say, no, that's garbage. I'm not sending that messaging. I want to do this instead. And so the content manager, never. Reps in marketing and leadership are always in full alignment. But that really falls on the content manager to raise their hand and say, hey, you guys need to work this out. Because again, the content manager is not the highest level strategist within the org. They're the executive branch, and you need clear, and this kind of goes into the next problem too, but you need a clear decision-making structure. So when the content manager comes into that roadblock or that bottleneck in the content supply chain, that content manager knows who to go to and who to say to, hey, this is what we're hearing from the reps. The content writer worked with the reps. They gave this feedback on this messaging. This is their feedback. This is their pushback. And then, marketing or leadership or the solution owner then can address that. But the content manager is responsible for kind of helping. They're kind of the mediator as well, right? Helping different departments or different functions within the org work things out if they're not in full alignment. And this actually goes back to, something that we'll see in orgs that don't have this function. As when we go in and when we function as the content manager and the content writer for some teams, we'll go in, we'll get directive from leadership to say, okay, here are the, 8 different sequences or cadences that we want you to write, and then we'll go to the reps and we'll write the sequences, and then we'll go back to leadership, and leadership says, what? This is what our reps are saying to customers? We had no idea. And that even though that, again, puts us in kind of an awkward situation where we're like, hey, you guys need to align on this, it's actually a really important function, because it's not that misalignment wouldn't be there if it wasn't called out. It would just continue and continue and continue until something gave. So I think it's really important to have that function, because it catches that misalignment early, so you don't end up with reps sending messaging that doesn't align with your go-to-market strategy. Another big problem I think is that the content manager sometimes is expected to perform all of the skill sets of the other functions, especially on teams that have, that are maybe just beginning to have a sales enablement or sales engagement strategy, that because the content manager sort of touches all of the different parts
Wait,
within the
wait,
content
can I
supply
stop you
chain.
for a second?
Yeah.
So are you saying that like basically someone could say you own everything content?
Yep.
And that might not be the right thing to, if you're a leader, that's not, might be not the right thing to do because there's different skill sets there. Is that what you're saying? Like, be wary of that. You might not want to put everything on one person, all things content.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a workaround, right? Again, if you're understaffed, for example, and you don't have the headcount or the capacity or the budget to have 3 or 4 people on your team putting effort into this, I think it's a choice that an organization can make to say, okay, we have one person that's going to be the analyst, the writer, the manager, the owner, the enabler. That's the right word for that. But it's not necessarily an obvious choice. Like it's a decision you can make under certain circumstances. But what I've seen is that when one person, I think we actually have people on our internal team that have been put in this situation before, where they're doing every single thing, and it might actually be a better use of hours within your org to say, okay, someone is really, really good at writing, so they should be able to dedicate, 5 hours a week or, 30 hours a month or whatever you need to writing that content. And maybe there's already somebody that's doing some analysis with Salesforce or with, another platform that could also do analysis and outreach. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is to say it's not an obvious choice to just have one person do everything sales engagement. It's a better choice to think about what skill sets are necessary to perform all of these functions and who is best suited to perform that.
Good.
And I think the benefit of having, as many eyes as possible on the content supply chain is that you get input from other areas in the org and you get sort of checks and balances so that, if one person is in charge of everything, they might not be making the best decisions about your content strategy, or they might just be sort of making it up as they go, which again, we see it at a lot of startups and it's not always unsuccessful, right? Sometimes it works well to just throw something out there and see what sticks and just reiterate as soon as possible. Yeah, totally. So I wouldn't discourage people from doing that. But if we're really talking about how can you make strategic, intentional decisions when you have resources to dedicate to these things, it is really important to not just assume that because this person is going to touch sort of every point on the content supply chain that they can actually perform that entire function. That the content manager is really a project manager first and foremost, and they're like you said, they're a great communicator, and that's the most important skill set to look for in someone that's going to be the content manager. They might not be a very good writer, but they should be a good project manager, and they should have really good communication skills.
Let's say I'm the leader of the process here, the operation, and I want to support the content manager. One of the pitfalls I could see, just to round out the whole, what could be some of the common challenges here. One of the pitfalls I could see is that I may not understand the capacity that's needed for the content manager. How do I could totally underestimate that. How could I figure out what is needed for the content manager, or how do I keep an eye on that? How do I support them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that happens often. I mean, I think you need to break down your content strategy into the smallest parts so you really understand what you're asking. I think a lot of times when people say, okay, our content needs to be industry focused and persona focused, and we need to have 3 tiers and different levels of automation, and what you're talking about might be like 40 or 50 sequences all of a sudden. And it's not obvious if it's not your day to day, but if you're asking someone to create and manage 40 or 50 sequences, I mean, that's a lot of work. And so I think really itemizing exactly what the ask is and documenting how many hours that's going to take to do it well. I mean, I think that would be the job
They
of
got
the
to
solution
experiment,
owner.
right? You got to experiment. Like
Absolutely.
let's just say from a content, give us some numbers here. And I realize that when we go into organizations, we give people specific information after we assess, like, hey, this is what you got going on, this is what you need, right? But like if I'm watching this and I'm thinking, well, we're a startup organization, like how many hours should a content manager allocate to our sales engagement? What about if I'm a mid-market? What if I've got a team of 100 plus reps? Like how much should we be allocating? And there's a lot of complexities here. So I know I'm putting you on the spot because if I've got over 100 salespeople or 500 salespeople, and then you got multiple teams, and then you got multiple industries that you're reaching out to, and so the whole content supply chain just goes and really it just blossoms because there's so much to think about. So I'm not holding you to like whatever Erika says, folks. Like you don't take that and say, okay, 10 hours and we're good. All right, like there needs to be discovery, but someone's got to start somewhere, and you got to test it, and you got to figure that out, what it is for you.
Yeah, I think another really important thing to note would be regions, right? If we're only talking about, let's say, North America, and we're talking about, 200 or 300 people or reps in an org, I mean, that's easily a full-time job for a content manager. It could be, too, that content manager could also do some writing and that the reps would also contribute to do some writing. And I think that's kind of the most common setup that we see is that there is a full-time person doing content management that's also responsible for writing or delegating the writing to the individual teams or the individual team managers. And so I would say that's pretty common in an organization of 200 or 300 reps. Once you get into the 300, 400, 500 reps, I think it's a full-time job just for a content manager. And again, this is assuming that you have a comprehensive content strategy that really incorporates the full life cycle of content. So you're A/B testing, you're creating quarterly sales plays, you're keeping up with your evergreen sequences, you might have events, you're going to have industry and persona-based sequences as well. So one full-time headcount for a team of 300 to 500 is reasonable. If you have, let's say, a smaller team or a startup and you're managing a team of, let's say, 10 to 15 reps and you're a single manager, I think it's fair to be able to test the function of a content manager to say, okay, that could be the team manager and it could be, 10 hours a week that they're really dedicating to this content process. Over time, once you start to operationalize it, it could be fewer hours, and that would assume that the reps would be very involved in the content creation process too. I think another important variable there is the complexity of your solution or your product, right? So if you're only selling like one platform and there's 10 or 15 reps, you're probably going to share sequences. But if you're, a global enterprise org and you're selling 20 or 30 different solutions, managing that content and creating that content is a totally different story. So there's so many variables, and I wish we had some algorithm where we could just plug in all of these variables and it would just spit out an answer of a good starting point. But we spend dozens of hours doing discovery just to be able to make specific recommendations. So I think I did the best I can, Theron, with that.
No, it's good. I think people just want to know, like, hey, like, what does it really take? And just to encourage you, everyone's trying to figure that out. And it takes some experimenting, but I think giving some baselines there to start with is really, really helpful for folks. So, no, I think it's great. Thank you for doing that. Any other, advice around, like, if you're if you're the leader, how can you best support this function?
I think, especially in the first year, just giving a lot of space for that content manager to give feedback, to say, hey, we first estimated that this would take 10 hours a week. In reality, I'm spending 20 or 25 hours a week. So either how can we rethink our strategy so that it fits more in this 10 hours a week, or how can I get more support? Also to kind of be able to measure and say, when it gets to be this amount of work, we are going to get another person on board to help support this function. And so just to be able to have parameters around that, about what's expected, and then in addition to that, having regular check-ins with whoever's performing that function, allowing for some trial and error there, I think is really important.
That's great. Well, hey, listen, I hope this video was really helpful to you, and you got some really good nuggets you can take away to help your own team. I mean, I think about content as, the content supply chain is such a really integral part of the sales engagement operation and initiative that, if you think about, a lot of times in sales, we talk about, the sales engagement platform being the engine, right? That the rep plugs in and they're executing that process, and like the data is like the fuel for the engine, right? You need that contact data. Well, I think that, another source of fuel in this is your content. You have to have content, and it has to be clean, not dirty fuel, and it has to be clean. And the content manager is really instrumental in making sure that fuel, that content is like ready to go, and it's clean, and so that your engine can burn, as hot as it can. So hope you enjoy that. Listen, check out the rest of the videos on sales engagement functions, and that way you start to understand how these work together and how it can help your team. And so anyway, have a great day, and hope you enjoyed that.
Hey, we hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something that you can apply today. If you're not receiving our monthly Greaser Drip where we share our insights, make sure you go to our website and subscribe so we can get that to you. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel here so that way you don't miss any videos like this one. And don't hesitate to reach out. If you need help with your sales engagement efforts, we want to talk to you. We want to hear how we can help. And until next time, this is Houston. Over